the landman saved the stony hill for the very tail of the sail, and when he got to it, he pushed his hat back and grinned and said, "And here is the crown of the whole estate, boys, 40 acres of the finest upright rock in the county. Plow her, and you will strike a spark. Hay her, and you will break a scythe. Who will give me $1?" And the crowd on the courthouse steps laughed the laugh a room lets go when it has held it in through 6 good parcels just to spend the whole of it on the 7th. Everybody in the valley knew the hogback, a long, steep spine of gray stone standing up out of the good bottom ground, too steep to plow and too poor to hay. The ground her father pointed his boy at to teach him the Lord made some land only to hold the rest of the county up out of the mud. So the landman asked his dollar and worked it down, 50 cents, a quarter, going once for the hog back, and it was folding back unsold when a small gray woman at the edge of the steps in a dead man's barn coat raised one finger and said, in a voice that took its time, $6. $6 for the rock farm. Verna Cobb, 63 years old, a lean, weathered widow a shade over 5 foot, with her hair gone iron under a man's felt hat, a woman the valley knew only as the little Cobb widow who had come down out of the mountains that spring and turned a handful of runty, rough-coated cattle loose to climb the rocks like goats. She had bid on the one piece of ground the whole county agreed a man could starve to death standing up on, and a fellow by the door hollered friendly as a slap, "Better buy a rope, too, Verna," so the cattle do not roll off, and the crowd came apart laughing, and the landman cracked it sold before she could come to her senses. She folded the paper into her coat and walked down through the middle of the grinning mess without cutting her step by an inch, because there was not one thing wrong with her hearing, and because she had worked a sum not one man on those steps had thought to do. She had come up in the high stone country where the good ground stands on end, and up there a body learns the plainest fact there is. That flat rich bottom is a fine thing to own 11 years out of 12 and a death trap the 12th, because water runs downhill and always has. She had watched the river take a whole valley when she was a girl, watched the fat lowland herds go under the fences in a single night while the poor hill families stood dry and counted their scrub cattle safe up on the rock. And she had never once forgot it. And to Verna, the hogback was no rock farm at all. It was the highest safe ground in the township, going for $6, and she had a dozen mountain-bred cattle that could live on cedar and thin grass and climb anything that had a foot to it. She bought the hogback for $6 and drove her little herd up the stone. Breeding the hardy scrub the valley men called runts and she called mountain stock, cattle that could paw a living off the steep rock and never bloat and never founder. And nobody drove past that hill louder than Lonzo Tackett, who ran 300 head of fat-blooded cattle on the richest bottom in the bend, and who stood at the sale barn that fall with his thumbs in his belt and told the loafing crowd that the mountain woman was grazing goats and calling them cattle up on a rock pile the Lord set there for the buzzards. And you cannot make a nickel off ground that stands straight up in the air. And he got his laugh, and Verna, down at the far rail, took her check and walked out through the middle of it without changing her step. If you are the kind of soul who can look at ground the whole county calls worthless and ask not what it will not grow, but what it will hold when the hard year comes, stay with me and subscribe before we go on, because the passed over that stood when the bought and paid for went under are the only stories we keep here, and the water was coming. It came the 3rd spring, a long, gray, soaking spring that would not quit. 6 weeks of rain on ground already full to the top, and then one warm black night a wall of water came down off the mountains all at once, and the river stood up out of its banks in the dark and walked clear across the valley bottom before a man could get his boots on. It took the low, sweet ground first, the way water has taken the low ground since the world began, and the fat-blooded cattle penned against the bottom fences had nowhere on God's earth to climb. And he went under in the night bawling, hundreds of them drowned against their own good wire, while their owners stood helpless on the roofs of their barns. Lonzo Tackett lost 200 head before the sun came up and watched the herd he had bred for 20 years roll away brown in the current, and there was not one thing money could do about water. And up on the hog back, the water never came. That was the thing not a man of them had figured on, that a dry stone hill standing 40 feet above the bottom is the one piece of ground in a drowning valley no flood can reach. And Verna's mountain cattle stood on the rock in the gray morning chewing their cud while the river ate the county, and she did not lose a hoof. Word of dry ground in a drowned valley travels faster than the flood does, and before the water even crested they came driving what stock they could still save up the stony path onto her hill. The same men who had told her to buy a rope, hazing soaked and staggering cattle up the rock in the rain, and Verna Cobb stood at the top of her worthless hill and waved every last one of them on. Come up. Come up, there is room. Lonzo Tackett came up the path himself with the 9 head he had left, on foot, leading them, his hat in his hand, though the rain still fell, and he stood on the rock he had told a wholesale barn was fit only for buzzards, and could not for a moment find anywhere to set his eyes. What he finally got out was that he had come to ask could his 9 head stay on her hill till the water went down, and whether come spring she would sell him some of her mountain stock to build back from, because his blooded cattle were gone and hers were standing. And Verna looked at him a long level while and said, "The hill is yours as long as the water is up, same as everybody. And the cattle I will sell you in the spring, fair price, the price they brought before the flood, and not $1 over it." Tackett said she could name any figure she pleased, and the whole bend would have to stand and pay it, and Verna worked her coat button a moment and said, "High ground costs a man nothing in a dry year, and everything in a wet one. And I have been the one caught short in the wet year, and I am too old to sell that off for one flood's money." And Lonzo Tackett, who had told a wholesale barn you cannot make a nickel off ground that stands straight up in the air, looked down off the one dry hill at the drowned valley full of his dead cattle and said, quieter than she had ever heard a loud man speak, "I was wrong about the hill, and wrong about you, and about the manner of it worst of all." And she said, "I know it, and there is dry hay in the cedar shed. Go and feed your 9 head. And that was the end of the war on that hill, not with a speech, but with 9 wet cattle eating dry hay on a rock pile the whole county had thrown away. The water went down and left the bottom a ruin of mud and broke wire. And all that spring and the next Verna Cobb sold her mountain stock into a bend that had nothing left alive to graze, fair price and no favorites, until half the cattle in the valley carried the tough hill blood she had driven down out of the mountains for $6 and a laugh. She farmed the hog back 11 more years and never once thought of trading it off for flat ground. And when she died old and easy in the wore-out Askins cabin she never left, the cattle path her little herd had worn up the gray stone still wound to the top plain has a county road, and it winds there yet, above the bottom the hill once saved. So look around you at whatever it is your own county is laughing at this year. The steep ground, the runty stock, the little gray woman nobody counted, and do the older arithmetic. And ask not what the crowd swears a thing is worth in the easy year, but what it will be worth on the black night the water rises. And if there was ever a piece of ground or a passed-over thing in your own life that everybody wrote clean off until the hard year came and it turned out to be the only thing left standing, tell me about it down below, and tell me which valley you are reading this from, and whether you would have bid the $6 on the hill or stood and laughed with the crowd on the steps. Because those are the stories we keep here. Think on it, and the wind comes up the hogback where the mountain cattle paw a living off the bare rock, and the little rough-coated herd comes down off the height at first light to the trough, and the bottom lies green and quiet under the hill that once saved it, and somewhere down the valley road a truck slows so a driver can look up at a dry stone hill. And the men who laughed on the courthouse steps are all these years gone still, and the woman nobody counted holds the high ground yet.